All right, I guess we can get started. How's everyone doing so far? That's great. So on today's agenda, we just have the solution for P0. We're going to cover that real quick, and then we're going to do a problem that's similar to P1, basically covering how promises work, async/await, just to familiarize you guys with the behaviors and what to do and what not to do. And then by doing a similar problem, hopefully this will give you a good baseline with regards to how to do the actual P1. So the purpose of P1 is to essentially, in terms of the details of the assignment, what you're supposed to do is access the Reddit API using fetch in JavaScript. It is a built-in module in the browser that you are using to run the code. So you basically pull data from Reddit. Reddit has an API that you can interface with. What we're doing here is super similar, so we're not actually hitting the API directly, but we're just calling a certain URL like you would with regular Reddit. I don't use it, but you guys get the premise. And then we just add .json at the end, and instead of returning a web page, it just returns a JSON file, which is the exact same response that you would get from an API. The reason we're not using a specific API for Reddit is because usually that comes with authorization. You need to create an account, and we don't want to force you guys to basically create any extra accounts. So this is a great way of basically it's essentially the same thing as hitting an API, because you're still making a web request, you're still using the same libraries, and you still get the same response structure back. So we're going to start with P0 first. Your assignment was to edit the P0, edit the array prototype, and then add a new method there that is an extension of map. The way map works, it takes a function as a parameter, and then it applies that function to every element in an array, and then returns a copy of that array with the function applied to everything. So map roulette is the same thing, but instead of taking one function, you take infinite amount of functions, and then for each element, choose a random of those functions, and then apply to the element, and then return the copy. So I don't think any of you did it incorrectly that I know of. I haven't looked at your code, but simply due to the fact that I'm recording, there were some people that essentially, instead of taking a random function for each element, they just took one random function and then they applied it to all of the elements without switching. So that was an incomplete assignment, and points were taken off of that. Not a lot. You still get most of the credit since you were mostly there. But so if we're going to do this in real time, what you're supposed to do when something along the lines of editing the array prototype, right? Basically introducing map roulette, setting it to a function, and then you could have done this, right? So you're using the spread operator, which is 3 dots, and then anything, any text goes here. So basically this takes all of the parameters that go into the function and then turns it into a list that you can access. You can also use the arguments keyword. So if I run this, these should return more or less the same thing. So if I just do this, you basically get, basically 2 iterables, right? So you can use either of these, and the way you basically implement the rest of the function, you can either do a for loop or you can use array.map. I'm just going to go with the for loop first. So you do, for example, so what this does, it uses this keyword to basically access the original array. So in this case, we have test defined to an array with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So this keyword in the function would reference to this array. So for I equals to 0, I is less than the array.length, and I plus 1, you basically can use this for loop to iterate through the entire array. Just some basic JavaScript fundamentals. So what you can do from there is access the actual element, right? So this would be this.I, for example. And then you want to select a random function to apply to the element. So the way we do this is, either with arguments or params keyword, but first we generate a random index, since our list of functions isn't iterable in JavaScript. So we can choose an index to choose from. So what we do is use math.random with math.floor. I'm sure there are other ways you can do this, but So in this case, we just use params. We can also use arguments for this, and I'll demonstrate this in a little bit. But we have our element, we have a random index, and then we can basically assign a random function with this random index. So what we do is, in this case, we can do params and then pass in our index. So what this does, it takes our list of functions and then it chooses a random one with the random index. And then what we can do is have an empty array at the beginning, and then push a new element into that, which is the result of the random function. In the examples that you had in programming 0, in the program assignment number 0, you saw that we passed multiple functions, like over here, for example. So let's say this element just adds 1 to it. Then we can have another one that's just 2, 3. And then there was an example that had multiple parameters. So this is a mirrored version of how map works, right? So it accepts functions that take at most 3 parameters. The first parameter would be the element, the second would be the index of the element, and then the third would be just the reference to the original array. So if we run this code right now, right, it'll work because we're not using index and R. But if we try to incorporate, index, for example, then this would throw an error, because what we are supposed to do is pass 3 functions or 3 parameters into the function regardless. So this is like basically the most tricky part in this assignment, right? You call the random function, you pass the element. If we are using this in like any one of these examples, this will be fine. And then we also pass the index and then the reference to the original array, which is this. So we pass them anyway, and the way JavaScript works is, unlike with Java, where you have a constructor with you can have multiple constructors and each one has a different number of parameters and they're all considered different constructors. In JavaScript, you have none of that. It's basically by name, right? You have random func, and then regardless of how many parameters you push into it, that function will still be the same. So we pass 2 more parameters into this, and then if they're not accessed, then they're just completely ignored. So this doesn't break any of the code. And then this basically allows functions like these to work. So finally, we just return 2ret, right, which is our array that we initialized at the very beginning. And we push all the values to it. And then if I just print this test case to console, then we should get a random function, not a random function. So we should get a new array with the random functions applied to our elements. And if we run this multiple times, then you see that we get different numbers every single time, because that's the whole point of random. Okay. What you can also do, and some people did, is instead of using, instead of declaring an array and then going through a for loop, you can just use the built-in array.map function. So here, we essentially do we declare this .map, right? We pass our 3 parameters into it, just like we did here, for example, right? And just like we did with this. And then for each one, we basically, so this runs for every element, like this declared function over here. So what we do with this information is we do the same, random generation. And then we return our random element that's applied here. But because, for example, in the for loop, we use I for index, here we have different variable names instead of using the this keyword. Or you could use this keyword in this case, but it doesn't really matter. So if we run this code, this should work the same way. Yep. So every time we get different numbers as well. So that's basically the majority of the assignment. And then, you can use params, but you can also completely remove this and just use arguments instead of all of this. So I just replace our 2 params with arguments, and then this should run the same way. Or not. And then since we print arguments to console, you see that in this case we basically have a map with all of the functions passed into it, and then the way we access it is through index. Okay, so that's the assignment. If you had this implementation, nice work. That's all you really needed to do besides the video. So for P1, let's talk about promises. So during the lecture, we basically covered that promises allow you to implement asynchronous programming pretty conveniently, right? As little boilerplate as possible, basically just getting the job done and trying to make the code look as concise as you can in terms of just having things flow naturally. So if I look at the repository for P1, we basically have a very small Reddit search interface. So the whole point of this is what your index.html file looks like. No, nothing special. You would put in something here, and this would search all of the subreddits, I believe, or all posts with those keywords in the title or in the description. I'm not sure. But what that does, it returns with Reddit, right? If you hit the right URL, then it returns a JSON file with all of your results. And what you can do with that is essentially, use that in your JavaScript file to pull more information based on the data that you were given initially. So if we look at this, right, we can use the Reddit search API over here. And then here's an example link that was given to you in the README, which you can use. So if we look up cats and boots, right, then you get a bunch of data. And then you can use this to essentially look up more subreddits and then list the subscriber count and then other parameters such as the actual Reddit post, the subreddit, and then the subs from that. So that's pretty much the premise of the whole idea. So what you need to do is two layers of fetch requests. One is the initial request that we trigger with the submit button. And then behind the scenes, after we run this request, we should also run a bunch of other requests that are requesting information for all the subreddits that those posts belong to. Okay. But because it's multiple levels, right? The second level is a lot bigger than the first one because the first one is just one request. But that request has posts from a ton of different subreddits. It could be 25, 100, I don't know. So making 25 requests back to back, first you do one, then you do another, then a third one, it all gets really slow. So the whole point of this time is to basically help your understanding of asynchronous programming in the context of submitting a bunch of requests at once and then just waiting for all of them to return. Okay. So we'll be using a different API for this demonstration, right? So because I don't want to give you the exact answer for the homework. There are a bunch of public APIs available on GitHub, right? I just did some quick, scouting. And then we're going to be using an API that focuses around fruit. Very simple. So they have a small database of about 100 fruits, and then they have a bunch of information around it, surrounding it, like the nutritional value, calories, sugars, so on and so forth. And then the actual name. Each fruit has an ID assigned to it, so we can use that for the second layer. And then, so let's get started. So what we're supposed to do is use the fetch API. So how this works is, we covered it in lecture as well. There are a few examples. So if I just bring this up. Right. This is basically just how it operates. So let's get started. If I run up some example API queries in the browser, I'm not sure if you can see, you probably can't see the URL, but in this case, we hit the API, which is the URL/API. And then the endpoint that we want to hit is fruit/calories. And then we give it two bounds. So the minimum and maximum amount of calories that a fruit can have. And then it returns all the results that match those parameters. So in this case, we do, in this example, between 0 and 1,000 calories. And you get a long list of fruits that fit this. Okay. And then we can also query each individual fruit by hitting the same endpoint, but instead of calories, you just replace it with actual ID, like the number 52 or 53, or 54, it doesn't matter. It actually does. And then you get, the individual information with regards to this. So how we can start with this example is using fetch. You do not need to use this line of code in your homework assignment because your homework assignment is part of the same index.html/main.js. Like you'll be running this through a browser through the front end, and the fetch function is built into it. For the purpose of this demonstration, just for my own convenience, I'll be using Node.js, which I'll be using in the future. But fetch isn't natively built into that, so you have to import a library. So that's what I do in this line of code. But you don't have to do this in your assignment, so just don't freak out if you don't know what this is. So this is the example that I just copied or that I just pasted from the Mozilla documentation. This is basically just an example block of code that fetches a bunch of movies from an example URL. This doesn't work. But what we can do is replace this with our initial query. Then if we run this block of code, then we'll get a bunch of results. So this is basically the same thing that you saw in the browser. So if I make this a little bit bigger, you'll see more of it, right? So for each fruit, we have the name, ID, family, order, genus, nutritional values, and so on. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. So with this, we use async/await to access the fruits variable, or to put the data into the fruits variable. We'll go over how this works with just promises, not async await, and the mechanics for that are a little bit different. So we have our initial layer that we want to use of data, and let's say we want to. What do we want to do with this? Let's say we want to take each fruit and then hit the API querying that individual fruit. Okay. So like here we have an array of fruits. We take the ID from each and then we pass like a request to the second layer. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I got a question. So await, are those like dependent on each other, or is that just part of the feedback?
Define dependent on each other.
Does one need to happen in order for the other to happen? Chronological in order?
Yes. So with promises, we basically use promise.then, and then if you want to execute code after that, you would have to call .then again, and then so on and so forth. That's how you change stuff. With these two awaits, the way they work is they are located inside of an async function. So this will not work without the async keyword, right? You see it lights up in red. So what this does is basically runs this line of code, waits for it to completely finish, and then it goes on. So yeah, they are in chronological order. The first one runs first, and then once it's done, if you're using await, it runs the second. This is very similar to the equivalent. It's very similar to using promise.then and then running .then after the initial one. So if I did this with promises, it would look something like we run the fetch function, and then we do .then. It would look like this, I guess. But then, so if we have code like after this, right, then it basically like, let's say if I do console log test, and I run this code without the, await stuff, then it would, like in your console, you would see, print.test. You would see print test the console, and then only then you would see, after some delay, right, once the response comes back, you would see the data being printed to console. So whether you use promises or async/await is up to you. Personally, I like using await because it's like it's just some extra syntax sugar to make your code look like a little bit simpler, right? So we're just gonna keep this method at the moment. So moving back to where we were, we have a list of fruits, right? We want to take each one and send a specialized query to the API. So what we do here is, let's say we want to take our individual query. In this example, we query by an ID of 52, but if I can just change that real quick to a parameter, then how this works is you can call this function, pass an ID into it, and then what it'll do is essentially print the individual fruit response. So what I can do is something like this, and then if I return the fruit in this case, then you'll see two things being printed. The first one is the initial list that we had, and then the second one is the the fruit and that we individually queried. So, well, here we have two consoles. So if I can just remove this, then right. So here we have the list from the first query, and then here's the one from the second. But it's not a list; it's just an object because that's the response structure of the specific endpoint. And then you would need to pay attention to this in your programming assignment because whether or not it's a list or not really will determine how you interact with the actual object that's sent back to you. Okay. So in this case, we just did one, right? Let's say we wanted to loop through all of the fruits and then query them. So we pull the ID by doing this, right? Or you can just do this line of code, also works. So for each fruit, you pull the ID and then you query the specific endpoint. So if I make this a little bit smaller, then you see we have this function right over here. So we do log fruit by ID, and then we pass the ID as a parameter. And what this does, it returns the fruit, so we can just assign this as well. And then we can do this, but if we run this code, you'll notice that it'll be abnormally slow. For the reason the reason for this is essentially in order to execute one request, you need to wait for the request behind it to complete, right? So this is the whole point of having await. So you loop through all the fruits, and then due to the nature of await, you have to wait for it to complete before you go on to the next iteration. Okay. The way we do that, the way we bypass this and basically send all the requests at once and then wait for all of them to come back, is using the hint that we had in the lecture from last Monday. Okay. So if I just pull this up right now, then you see we use the promise object or the promise class, and then call the promise.all function, pass an array of promises, which in this case are our requests. And then what this does, it basically waits for all of the promises to resolve, which in this case the request to come back. And then if one of them fails, then we just fail the entire thing. And then if all of them go through, then we return a list with all of the resolved promises. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. So we can do this in multiple ways. I'll just keep the for loop for now. So we initialize an empty array called promises. Could be named anything that you want as long as it's relevant. And then instead of awaiting, what you can do is push the promise to our array. Okay. And then at the moment, this won't do anything because if we print this, then you'll just get an array of a bunch of promises. So you see, in this case, we just have a bunch of a bunch of pending promises. Okay. So how we resolve all of those and wait them and convert them to a list with all the information that we want to have is by using promise.all. So if we print this, then you'll basically get, this is a little messy. So instead of returning fruit, let's just return fruit.name. Of course, this will change with your assignment. So we print our, our promises just like we just did, right? And then after they all resolve, we print our results. So if you haven't noticed, this runs a lot faster than our previous iterative example. The reason being is because now we don't wait for each one to complete before sending another request. We just send all of them, and then we wait for all of them to resolve. Okay. In your programming assignment, you will basically have posts that may or may not belong to the same subreddits. Okay, so like a subreddit has a bunch of posts in it. So when you look up a post with the keywords like cat and boots, then you can have a bunch of posts from different subreddits. Two posts can be from the same one. You don't want to send, like, let's say you have 100 posts that belong to a total of 10 subreddits. You don't want to send 100 requests. So in this case, we loop through all of the fruit, right? And then we send each one, like each request individually. If you do the same thing with your homework assignment, you'll be sending 100 separate requests to the subreddit, even though there are only 10 subreddits. So it's a little bit wasteful. So what you're supposed to do is basically filter out any duplicates, right? And the way you do that is, well, first you identify where the subreddit is housed in the response. So here we have children, which is an array of all of the posts that you have, right? And then each one has a parameter that's called either subreddit or subreddit name prefixed or subreddit ID, right? For our purposes, you can use whatever. You can use name or like the prefix or the ID, but it's just better practice, like in industry, to always identify some object by its ID because IDs are meant to be unique, right? So I'm not sure if there could be subreddits with multiple subreddits with the same name. Probably not, but like there's a possibility that that is the case. So just do it by ID, right? It'll just reduce the chances of you accidentally combining or like treating multiple subreddits with the same name as just one subreddit. Okay. So what we do is we have our children object, which is a list and a bunch of. We're just going to continue with this. So this is just an example, right? I'm just trying to create a mock structure of the response that you're going to receive in your homework assignment, right? So you'll have, let's see. Right. Let's say like each of these objects represents a different post, and each post has, like it belongs to a certain subreddit. So let's make all of them belong to the same subreddit. So the thing is, if we loop through all of these and then basically try to query, the subreddit ID, then you'll be sending 5 of the same requests and you'll be getting the same information back, and you're just wasting performance and bandwidth. So what you're supposed to do is filter by unique subreddit IDs, right? So there are multiple ways of doing this. Okay. The way that I'm going to show you right now, and you can always look this up a bit later, is just using the set object that is native to JavaScript. So first we want to basically isolate all of the IDs from our array, right? So we can do this. And then let me just comment all of this previous stuff out. So if you run this code, then you'll get an array with all of the subreddit IDs. Okay, so if you run this on your actual response, then you'll get obviously a much longer list with many other IDs. But just for the purpose of this example, let's change 2 of them to have different IDs. So if we run this again, instead of having 5 of the same IDs, we have 3 of the same IDs and then 2 unique ones identified by 33 and 32 instead of 3J. Okay. So we want to remove the duplicates from this, and how we can do this is by doing something like this. Let me see if this works. Okay, so that does work. All right, so what we do in this case is we basically create like an empty array, right? And then we assign certain values to it. And for that, we use the set object. And the way that works is essentially it takes an array and then it creates a set object with basically all of the unique individual elements that are in that array. So if there are duplicates, then it just gets ignored. And then because a set is not necessarily an array, what we do is we use the spread operator to convert it to an array. So a set is an iterable, and then with an iterable, you can use the spread operator, which converts it to a list, and then you can assign it to an array. So what we do here is we have our raw array of IDs, which we have from this example, and then we basically clean that down to just 3 unique ones. And then with your actual assignment, it'll be however many unique subreddit IDs. Okay. So what you're supposed to do with that information is, you take those subreddits and then you look each one up individually, and then you do by the way you do that is with the example that I showed previously. So use like a for loop, have an array of promises, then push to that loop, push to that array, and then just use the promise dot all for all of it. What you can also do is use dot map, and just like with program assignment number 0, if you use dot map, your code will look a lot cleaner because you're not using messy loops. So instead of doing this, what we can do is have our list of fruits, and then for each one, access the element, and then return the result of our function. And then this should work the same way. So instead of having all of this, we can just have one line of code that does the same job. And then just in general for this class, we recommend trying to use these functions as much as possible, simply because it's just a good way to get you to learn about like the function-based approach that JavaScript takes to like most of its behaviors. So instead of thinking, oh, I could like initialize an empty array and then do a for loop and then like push stuff to it, you can just do array.map or array.forEach. Basically just condenses your code down to something that's a lot more readable, right? And then just cleaner, and then more robust because there's less space for error. Okay. So if I run this code, then you'll see we print our promises, and then once all the requests resolve, then we print all of our fruit names. So with this case, we just use fruits for this example. With program assignment number 1, you would do the first layer would be a list of posts, and then the second layer would be basically like all the subreddits. And what you're supposed to do with all that information is essentially combine it and return the list in a format that's accepted by the actual code, right? That's like the boilerplate code that's provided to you. So what it's looking for is essentially an array with a bunch of elements of this format. So each object should have like a Reddit post and subreddit, and then subreddit subs. For purposes of this assignment, instead of doing subreddit IDs, like you can do subreddit name, simply because it's just going to be a little bit easier for you guys, because there's less like JavaScript tricks that you need to know in order to do that. But in general, you would do it by ID. But like if we treat the IDs as names, then what we can do is essentially take each one of those names and then hit a link like this, for example. So what this does, the URL is reddit.com, r videos, and then about.json. So it basically takes the r/video subreddit and then returns the information like about that. And what you're interested in is the subscriber count, which is this field right over here. Okay. So each one, has a different number of subscribers. And what you want to do is basically include that in the response that you return. So long story short, let's see how we can apply this to our example. So we have our fruits. So this is the equivalent of our posts. And then for each individual fruit, we send a, specialized request. And then that is the equivalent of looking up the subreddit information. So let's say we want to do some stuff with the fruit. That came out wrong. But if I print all of this, we have, let's see, like the name and ID. So what if we want to append that to our original array, right? So this example is not the best because the responses from the like specialized routes are like the same format and they contain the same information as the actual like larger list. But what we can do is pretend that they're like different, and then the same concept can be applied to the Reddit post. So let's say each one returns let's say instead of returning an object, we return a unique string that is, the name plus ID. So like this would be like Pomelo 98. Okay. So if you run this code, you will see a bunch of these different results. Okay. Like apple 6, lemon 26, and so on and so forth. And then we want to link this back to our initial fruits or list. Okay. So the way we can do that is in this map function. We could try something like this. And then if we print fruits after everything resolves, then you see our like initial list of all of the fruits. And then for each fruit, we add a new parameter called, our new ID. And then it's, the mangosteen 99. It's basically like the unique string that we created. So this is like one step closer to where you want to be with your Reddit assignment. Okay. But as with, if you look at the response structure of our example, like reddit.com search, right, there's a lot of garbage that we don't want to show. Okay. So we can just filter that out by using another map function. So we can just do, fruits.map, and then for each fruit, whoops, we want to return like very specific, like let's say we want to return the name, ID, and then print that to console and run this code again. Then it doesn't do what we want. Hold on. All right. Okay. Whoops. So the way map works, it returns a copy of the array. So we're not like editing the original one. So that was my mistake. If we assign this to a new variable and then print it instead, then we'll have our condensed list. So in this case, we have like name, ID, and then our unique string that we generated. So you would basically apply the same concept to your actual programming assignment. And instead of returning like food information, you would return the actual like Reddit stuff that you want, that the assignment wants. So you return, the Reddit post, which is already in the individual like post information. Let's see if we can find the parameter here. Like the title, right? So this is the title of the post. So like that is what you treat it as. Okay, and then the subreddit is the videos, which you have right over here, for example, right? And then you get this information from our second layer of requests, which is the amount of subscribers to that subreddit, and then we get that from our second layer over here. Okay, and then you do the same thing as we did with our food example, and then you get this condensed list. And what you're also supposed to do is sort the whole thing by the number of subscribers, I believe. Yep. So it should be the array should be ordered from highest to lowest subscribers. Okay. And how you do that is use the array.sort function. All right. If you want to look at the documentation for how it works, you can just look, JavaScript array.sort, and then the Mozilla developer documentation will be the first result that comes up. Then you'll have a bunch of examples of how it works. If you want to, these examples are with numbers, for example, and strings. But if you want to sort objects by a certain parameter, what you can do is something along the lines of this. And then how we implement this in our example would be new fruits.sort and then this takes a function as a parameter, right? Fruit1, fruit2, and then what you can do, we'll just sort by IDs in this case, right? So you see, like in this case, they're all randomized. You have 52, 3, 1, 5. So if we want to sort them in order from most or like largest to smallest ID, so in the Reddit assignment, it will be the largest number of subscribers to the least. In this example, we can sort by IDs, and we can essentially sort in descending order. And then dot sort modifies the original array, so it doesn't return a copy. So if we print this, this should have our sorted array, which is what we have right here. So we have a bunch of fruits, and then we sort them by ID, 99, 98, and it's all in descending order. So with that, you essentially uncomment this line. So this was commented in the initial one, right? In the initial assignment, so you just remove this, and then have your implementation in this function. And then if everything's correct, then it should display in the web browser. One additional component to the homework assignment, we have 10 minutes left. So one additional component to this is essentially knowing the right format to pass. Knowing the right format of the URL that you want to pass to the API, right? So with our previous slides, you have the URL object somewhere over here. I'm not sure if the professor uses like this exact formatting, but the code is pretty much the same. So you have the URL object, which is native to like the HTML5 stuff that you're using at the moment, right? You can have your initial endpoint, and then you can do url.searchparams.set, and then let's see. Like here we want, actually we don't send, well, we send on queries in here. So let's say this is what we want to generate, okay? The way we would deal with this is basically just like in the example in the slides. Basically have this, and then what we would do is basically do url.searchparams.set, whoops, and then q is the query, right? So we just pass this as the first parameter, and then in the second one, we basically pass this, and then if we and then you can just pass this object to like fetch, okay? So when you run your fetch code, then it would just be this, because it accepts some any URL object. And then let's see if I can so if I save it and then run this code with our network tab open, it definitely, that's the wrong one. Right, so if I look up the information for this, in the network response, what we do is exactly this. So the whole point of this is to essentially format the URL string in such a way that it's actually accepted by Reddit. So if you look at our example, like here it includes the plus, this is the URL that we want, but here it doesn't. Okay, so in your homework assignment, like we're not going to type in cats plus boots. We're going to type in cats space boots, and then we expect all of the automatic parsing to be done by your code in order for the Reddit API to accept it. Does that make sense? So all of the heavy lifting is done for you. All you have to do is create the actual object, right? And then just set it the search parameters, and then use it in your fetch statement. Okay. That's pretty much the whole thing for P1. So if no one has any questions, then we can just leave it at that.